Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the steamy candlelit world of ancient Rome, a place where the marble floors are polished, the silk sheets are carefully arranged, and the expectations behind closed doors are anything but subtle. What was sex really like back then? Well, let's just say if you think your dating life is complicated, buckle up. You're about to be dropped into a world where who you loved, or rather who you used, wasn't just about emotion or attraction. It was politics, it was dominance, it was image. And honestly, you probably won't survive this if you go in with modern assumptions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you in right now, and what time is it? I want to imagine the exact setting as you listen to this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by stepping through the arched doorway of a Roman domus, the private family home of the upper class. It smells faintly of oil lamps, crushed laurel, and polished stone. A slave closes the door behind you. You're here as an observer, but let's not pretend you're invisible. Everyone here notices you, because in Roman society, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a public performance written in your posture, your clothing, your household layout, even the arrangement of your bedroom furniture. Yes, seriously, the Roman bed wasn't just a bed, it was a symbol. Inside the atrium you find a careful architecture of sexuality and social hierarchy. The cubiculum, or bedroom, sits not tucked away for privacy, but often accessible, sometimes even visible from the main hall. For elite Romans, especially men, sex wasn't something to be hidden, it was something to own. The act itself might happen in shadows, but its implications echoed across dinner parties and Senate meetings. If you were a man, your sexual conquests weren't just permitted, they were expected, and not just with your wife. Wives were for heirs, desire was for others. You pass by frescoes on the wall. Some are mythological, sure, but others are just graphic. Bodies tangled in ecstatic poses, gods mid-transformation, mortals clearly not worried about curtains. These weren't considered dirty or embarrassing, they were decorations, a talking point over wine. Romans had no shortage of ways to celebrate eroticism in their living spaces. Picture it. You're reclining at a dinner party, sipping spiced wine, chatting about grain imports while a fresco of Pan getting it on with a goat stares down at you. It's casual. And don't get the idea that this open expression meant free love for all. Far from it. Everything was about who was doing what to whom. You could be as sexually wild as you wanted, as long as you were dominant. Being the giver in a sexual act was seen as masculine, powerful, respectable. Being the receiver, risky business, unless you were a slave, prostitute, or someone outside the citizen class. For free Roman men, this distinction was everything. And for women, well, that's where it gets more suffocating. Step into a matron's shoes. You're born into a high-status family, maybe married off at 14, to a man twice your age, or 3 times, depending on how many prior wives he's buried. Your role is to be modest, fertile, and discreet. You probably won't get a say in anything beyond curtain fabric. Yet behind the scenes, you might be hosting secret lovers, writing veiled love poetry, or confiding in a trusted maid. You have to be clever, because if your affairs come to light, that's death sentence, or exile if you're lucky. Adultery was technically a crime for women, but not for men. A husband could do what he wanted, and you were expected to keep your sandals laced and your eyes down. Not that love didn't exist. Oh, it did, sometimes in the form of aching poetry, tear-streaked goodbyes, or longing glances in the marketplace. But it rarely looked like marriage, and when love did creep into the villa, it often did so through back doors, via slaves, secretaries, musicians, or foreign courtesans who knew how to play the game. Love was a gamble, marriage was a strategy. Now, if you're wondering where romance fits into all this, yeah, so were they. Ancient Roman romance wasn't built around the slow-burn emotional intimacy you're used to seeing in period dramas. It was often transactional. If you were rich, you pursued pleasure as a right. If you were poor, your choices were limited, maybe a hurried affair in the back of a tavern, or if you were lucky, an affair with someone slightly above your station. One historical fact for you. Emperor Augustus, the guy who reshaped the whole empire, passed morality laws encouraging marriage and childbearing. He even penalised bachelors and gave tax perks to parents with 3 or more kids. And yet, his own daughter Julia became infamous for having lovers in every port. Irony, thy name is patrician hypocrisy. Here's a quirky detail. Romans believed certain foods influenced sexual vigor. Oysters, yes, but also cabbage. That's right, some Roman men were convinced that raw cabbage could spark a fiery night in the sheets. Imagine nibbling lettuce seductively before a tryst. Not exactly smooth, but hey, they swore by it. Still, despite all the mosaics and statues with their prominent anatomical enthusiasm, historians still debate just how liberal Rome really was. Were all those sex-filled images meant to reflect real-life behaviours, or were they part of an idealised performative culture where showing off was everything? Some scholars argue that the anything-goes Rome is a modern fantasy projected onto a deeply stratified moralistic society. Others say that yes, Romans were as sexually expressive as their art suggests, and that the moralists were simply shouting into the void like a toga-clad version of Think of the Children. As you finish exploring this domus, you start to get it. Sexuality in Rome wasn't about mutuality, it was about control. Pleasure was often one-sided. Consent wasn't part of the conversation unless you were in the rarest kind of relationship. One built on deep affection, trust, and above all equality, which was about as rare as a chaste senator. You step back out into the sun-bleached streets of Rome, but now your eyes are trained differently. You've seen what happens behind the silk curtains and under the frescoed ceilings, but what about the rules? The invisible grid of laws and expectations that dictated who could sleep with whom, and what happened when people broke the code? Welcome to the very Roman concept of lex de pudicitia, the law of modesty. And oh boy, does it not play fair. Rome had laws for everything: roads, grain rations, togas, and of course sex. Not because the state was particularly prudish, but because sex was about order. Who belonged where, who had power and who didn't. Start with the Augustan marriage laws. These weren't casual little guidelines printed in a pamphlet. These were state-enforced mandates. Augustus, trying to restore what he called traditional values, after decades of civil war and orgy-fueled aristocracy, decreed that Roman citizens needed to marry and reproduce. Childless couples paid the higher taxes. Widows were expected to remarry within a set period. Adultery? Suddenly a public crime, and who could be punished? Not the cheating husband, nope, his wife, or her lover. Even if she was stuck in a loveless political marriage to someone 3 times her age. Let's say you're a Roman woman who's caught cheating. The punishment could be exile, literal banishment to an island. You might lose your property, your children, even your patria potestas, that is your father's protection. You could also be classified as a meretrix, a registered prostitute, meaning any future romantic relationship would legally be treated as commercial. That label stuck like olive oil on linen. But if you were a man, well, unless your affair was with another man's wife, you were generally in the clear. You could sleep with slaves, concubines, prostitutes, anyone considered outside the respectable Roman citizen pool. The only real legal red line was violating someone else's pudicitia, a concept tied up with modesty, honour, and the illusion of control. And by someone, they usually meant upper-class women and adolescent citizen boys. Anyone else? Fair game? Now here's where things get even more tangled. Say you're a Roman senator, you've got money, clout, and access, but even you can't marry just anyone. There were strict restrictions against marrying actresses, dancers, or prostitutes, even retired ones. If you tried, your political career could crash faster than a chariot with a broken axle. The idea was that women with immoral backgrounds would pollute the bloodline and shame the family name. Of course, that didn't stop many senators from visiting those same women regularly. Just don't try to make it official. The legal system also involved a charming practice called accusatio stupri, or accusation of defilement. If a young woman was believed to have lost her virginity out of wedlock, her father or male guardian could sue the offender. This wasn't about justice, it was about compensation for dishonour. The girl's feelings? Irrelevant. In many cases, the accused would pay a fine or marry the girl to restore her value. Romantic, huh? Now imagine a Roman courtroom. Marble columns, stern magistrates, a sweating defendant in a worn tunic. He's accused of seducing a senator's daughter. There's talk of letters, poetry, secret meetings in gardens. It's scandalous. The crowd leans in. But the outcome doesn't really hinge on truth. It hinges on status. Who's more powerful? Whose connections reach further? Justice in Rome wasn't blind. It was watching very closely to see whose name mattered more. One historical example that always stirs debate is the case of Clodia Pulchra and Marcus Caelius Rufus. Clodia, an aristocratic woman with a reputation for affairs and poisonings, depending on who you ask, accused Caelius, her former lover, of attempted murder. He fired back, accusing her of promiscuity and corruption. Enter Cicero, Rome's most famous orator, who turned the courtroom into a theatre of slut-shaming and class warfare. He painted Clodia as a wild widow with too much freedom and not enough morals. The jury laughed, Caelius was acquitted, and Clodia's name became a cultural punchline for centuries. But was she guilty? Or just a woman who played by male rules and got burned for it? Scholars still argue. Now, for something a little quirkier, there was an old Roman ritual called the lectisternium, a public banquet where statues of gods were placed on couches and served food as if they were living guests. During times of crisis, like famine or plague, Romans would literally try to appease the divine with offerings, including acts of purification, mass fasting, and sometimes mass abstinence. That's right, sex bans, temporary celibacy imposed to avoid offending the gods. Whether people followed them, that's another question. Human nature being what it is, probably not. Interestingly, many laws regulating sex weren't really about protecting people, they were about appearances. Roman society valued gravitas, or seriousness, especially for men. If you indulged too openly, flaunted affairs, or got caught in scandal, you weren't just a bad boy, you were unstable, untrustworthy, dangerous to the Republic. Even emperors weren't safe. Julius Caesar was famously rumoured to be every woman's man and every man's woman. His enemies used that against him. True or not, the gossip stuck. Which brings us to a deeper debate among historians. Were these laws actually enforced, or were they just threats used selectively by the powerful? The evidence is fuzzy. While some people were indeed punished or exiled, many seem to have flaunted the rules with little consequence. Maybe the laws were like the city's aqueducts, impressive in theory but full of leaks. What's certain is that in ancient Rome, sex wasn't just a personal decision. It was a civic act. It had consequences that could touch every corner of your life, your property, your future, your name, and while men wrote the laws, shaped the debates, and dodged most of the punishment, women bore the brunt of enforcement. Same story, different century. By the time you return to the alleyways outside the Domus, you realize that Roman sexuality wasn't just about appetite. It was about order, control, and keeping people in their place, legally, socially, politically. And if the law said you were out of line, well, the Senate might not come for your head, but they'd definitely come for your reputation. You walk a little farther now, your sandals skimming the sun-warmed cobblestones, and suddenly you see it, Rome's true engine humming beneath the marble and politics. Power. Tonight, we're not just talking about who had sex with whom, but who was on top, socially, politically, and quite literally. In Rome, sex wasn't just about pleasure. It was about dominance, and everyone knew exactly where they stood, or lay. Let's get something clear right away. Roman culture didn't divide sexuality by gender the way we often do now. No one was labelled straight or gay. The key distinction wasn't who you were having sex with, it was what role you played. If you were the penetrator, you were in the power seat. You were dominant, assertive, masculine. That was fine, applauded even. But if you were on the receiving end, that was where things got messy, especially if you were a citizen male. Because submitting in any way, emotionally, sexually, was seen as weakness, effeminacy, a social stumble in a world obsessed with hierarchy. So imagine this. You're a Roman aristocrat, reclining at a dinner party, smug and wine-loose, boasting about your latest escapades. No one cares if your lover was male or female. What matters is that you did the taking, not the giving. You were in control. If you mention a male slave, no one blinks. But if you hint that you enjoyed being the receptive partner, even in a joke, there are awkward silences. Maybe someone shifts in their seat. Your status suddenly feels thinner than your tunic. This distinction ran deep. Even Roman slang reflected it. The word synedus was a term of scorn for a man who was seen as passive in sex, especially with other men. It implied weakness, softness, a failure of Roman masculinity. On the other hand, a man who dominated slaves or prostitutes of either gender? Perfectly fine. In fact, it might even boost your reputation, as long as no one important took offence. Now, you might be wondering, what about women? Were they held to the same logic? Yes and no. Roman women, especially upper-class ones, weren't supposed to want sex, let alone initiate it. Female desire was dangerous, something to be managed, contained, like a kitchen fire or a Senate debate. The ideal Roman woman was modest, silent, and obedient. But that didn't mean women had no power at all. Some of them used the exact rules of dominance to flip the game. Enter the rare but fascinating figure of the domina, a woman who through wealth, cleverness, or sheer audacity gained sexual power. Maybe she was a widow with property, free from her husband's control. Maybe she was a noblewoman like Messalina, who, according to scandalous gossip, disguised herself and competed with prostitutes in brothels just to prove her stamina. Whether those stories were true or not isn't the point. The point is that Rome feared women with unchecked sexual agency. They represented chaos, upturned hierarchies. They were walking breaches in the power structure. Take another stroll with me, this time into a barracks on the edge of the empire, where a Roman general is disciplining his troops, not with lashes or chains, but by humiliating them. One punishment, reserved for cowardice or mutiny, was forced sexual submission. It wasn't about sex, it was about reducing someone's status to the lowest possible level, turning them into a thing. That's how Roman minds understood dominance. It wasn't about the act, it was about transforming the other person into less than human. One historical example, the poet Martial, always quick with a jab, once mocked a senator for allegedly receiving oral sex from a male slave. Martial's issue wasn't that the act happened, it was that the senator let it happen to him. In a society so obsessed with rank, even your bedroom choices could affect your political standing. If people thought you lacked control in private, they doubted you had any business in public life. Now, here's a slightly weirder fact. Romans saw the body as a literal metaphor for the state. Just as the head ruled the limbs, the man ruled the household, and Rome ruled the provinces. To submit sexually was to invert that structure. That's why so many sexual insults in Roman comedy are political. You weren't just dirty, you were unstable. An insult to the empire's order. You stumble across a stall selling wax figurines, tiny exaggerated representations of people caught mid-coitus. You blink. Some of them are almost cartoonish in their detail, others shockingly lifelike. These weren't just trinkets, they were talismans, sometimes used in fertility rituals, as sometimes just for fun. But their exaggerated forms always had a point. This is who has the power. Look at the size, the posture, the smirk. Even in play, the hierarchy stood tall. There's a scholarly debate that bubbles just under the surface of all this. Were the Romans really as obsessed with power dynamics as we think, or are we projecting modern ideas backward? Some argue that we overread the sources, that Roman sexuality was more complex and private than we give it credit for. Others insist that the sheer volume of jokes, insults, legal codes, and art devoted to sexual dominance proves otherwise. Rome was about order, and sex was one more battlefield on which to assert it. Another quirk? Even Roman astrology got in on the act. Some guides warned that being born under certain constellations, like Virgo or Pisces, could predispose a boy to passivity. That's right. Your future bedroom role, written in the stars, it wasn't science, but it wasn't just superstition either. It was yet another layer in a society obsessed with categorizing control. By the time the sun begins to dip behind the tiled roofs and temple columns, you start to understand something unsettling. Sex in Rome wasn't just about desire, it was about ranking. Every act confirmed or challenged the structure of the world. The powerful took, the weak received. That was the rule. And if you dared to blur that line, well, you better have a fast horse and a forgiving reputation. The light fades as you step deeper into the quieter districts of Rome, where the stone walls muffle the hum of the streets and the scent of incense drifts from behind closed shutters. You pass rows of respectable homes, modest but well kept. These are the domains of marriage, of household management, of whispered hopes for lineage and legacy. But here's the thing. Roman marriage wasn't built on romance. It was a chessboard, and every piece was moved by strategy. If you've ever thought your dating life was transactional, meet the Roman version of love, marriage as alliance. For the elite, tying the knot wasn't about chemistry, it was about consolidating wealth, cementing family alliances, and boosting one's standing in the political ladder. Imagine your father arranging your wedding before your voice has even changed. Because your bride's uncle has ties to a senator, you don't get to protest. You smile, you show up, you say, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, the Roman equivalent of I do, and boom, you're married. Congratulations, now go make heirs. For women, the situation was more intense. Many Roman girls were married off around the age of 12 to 14. That wasn't shocking by their standards, it was considered ideal. The earlier a girl was wed, the more years she could be fertile, and fertility was her primary job. Emotional maturity, personal preference, or attraction, not even on the checklist. The ideal Roman matron was chaste, obedient, and prolific. Her entire public identity was tied to how well she bore and raised legitimate children. And yet, despite the cold contract of marriage, people were still people. You can't legislate away longing. Husbands strayed, of course, often without much secrecy or shame. If you were wealthy, you might keep a concubine or two, maybe a few slaves designated for your pleasure. For men, this was normal. It didn't matter whether your side partners were women or men, so long as they weren't someone else's wife or a freeborn Roman citizen. The law and society didn't care about feelings, they cared about status contamination. Now, Roman wives, their options were far more limited. Adultery wasn't just frowned upon, it was criminal. If caught, a wife could be divorced on the spot, publicly shamed and exiled. Her lover could be executed, especially if he was a lower-class man encroaching on noble blood. And if the husband didn't report her, he himself could face legal consequences for not acting fast enough to defend his household's honour. That's how seriously they took marital control. It was practically state business. But don't let that fool you into thinking all Roman wives were meek little statues. Some were sharp, cunning, and unafraid to bend the rules in quiet ways. Letters, secret meetings, coded poetry, alliances with sympathetic servants. It's all in the historical record, tucked between the official lines. One famous woman, Sempronia, was involved in the Catiline conspiracy, and described as both politically savvy and sexually bold. The historian Sallust practically clutched his pearls writing about her. He couldn't believe a woman could be that intelligent and that uninhibited. Imagine that. One of the more revealing practices of Roman marriage was manus, literally hand. There were two main types of marriage, one in which the wife passed into her husband's manus, meaning he legally controlled her as if she were a daughter, and another, more modern version, in which she remained under her father's control. Why would a couple choose that second option? Because sometimes being your husband's legal child was just a step too far, even for Rome. Over time, this latter arrangement became more common, especially among elite families trying to keep property in the paternal line. Now here's a quirky little custom that says a lot. On the wedding night, it was traditional for the bride to remove her tunica recta, her special wedding dress, in front of her new husband, and no one else. She also unbound her hair, a signal of submission to her new life. Some sources claim the husband would symbolically take a belt off her tunic, perhaps with a ceremonial phrase like, "Thus I claim you." It's intimate, yes, but also deeply performative. Sex wasn't just about connection, it was a rite of passage, a confirmation that the alliance had taken root. And what if the marriage didn't work? Divorce in Rome wasn't rare. In fact, it was relatively easy, at least for the man. He could issue a notice, return the wife's dowry, and that was it. A woman technically could also initiate divorce, but only under specific legal and financial conditions. The key question was always, who has the leverage? If she had a powerful father or her own fortune, she might walk. If not, she stayed, or she vanished into domestic obscurity. One historical case that always raises eyebrows is that of Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus. She divorced her first husband while pregnant with his child so she could marry Octavian, the future emperor. Bold move, right? It shocked everyone. But Octavian was powerful enough to override the scandal, and Livia played her role to perfection afterward, becoming the ultimate Roman matron, discreet, intelligent, and ruthlessly loyal to the imperial brand. Scholars still debate whether her first husband had any say at all. Probably not. And then there were the truly bizarre cases. Emperor Claudius married his niece Agrippina, who had her own child from a previous marriage, young Nero. Yes, that Nero. Claudius adopted him, raising him as heir. Agrippina, ambitious and calculating, knew exactly what she was doing. Later rumours, unconfirmed but popular, suggested she seduced Claudius to maintain her grip on power. Did it happen? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that people believed it says a lot about how Romans understood the power plays inside a marriage. Scholars continue to argue about how much affection existed in Roman marriages. Some say it was purely political, a matter of duty and lineage. Others believe that real affection, and even love, did bloom within these rigid structures. They point to tomb inscriptions where husbands and wives praised each other with unexpected tenderness. One gravestone reads, "To my wife, who lived with me in harmony for 40 years, without a quarrel." That's either deep affection or the most passive-aggressive eulogy ever written. Still, walking through these quiet neighborhoods, you can feel the weight of performance. Every marriage had to look proper, every child had to be legitimate, every gesture, from the dowry to the dinner seating, reinforced a system of appearances, and behind closed doors, maybe there was kindness, maybe there was resentment, maybe, if you were very lucky, there was something like love. But the system didn't care. It just wanted the next generation, the next heir, the next alliance. Romance was optional, legacy was not. You've wandered through the formalities of Roman marriage, that stiff toga-wrapped ritual of lineage and legacy, but now you slip down a narrower street, one that smells faintly of myrrh, roasted nuts, and sweat. It leads you not into a grand domus, but into the shadowy corners of the Roman heart, where passion wasn't framed by contracts or contracts disguised as vows. Here, it's about the unofficial, the in-between, the spaces where desire did whatever it wanted, as long as it didn't threaten someone's status. Welcome to the world of mistresses, courtesans, and concubines. Start with the concubine. In Rome, the term wasn't as scandalous as it sounds today. A concubina was often a long-term companion, sometimes a slave, sometimes a freedwoman, legally recognized but not officially wed. For men of means, especially those tired of politically strategic wives, concubines offered something more personal, less bound by obligation, more open to real affection, or at least the fantasy of it. They couldn't inherit, they had no dowry, and their children, while often raised within the household, were rarely considered heirs. Still, some men kept concubines for decades. Some even grew old together. The line between mistress and life partner could blur, just not legally. And let's be clear, women couldn't have concubines, not officially anyway. The system was built for male indulgence. A woman who took on a male lover outside of marriage was labelled an adulteress, even if the relationship lasted for years. That double standard? Oh, it wasn't subtle. It strutted down the street in a red cloak and winked at everyone. Now, a step up in style and independence. The meretrix, the high-end courtesan. These women weren't housekeepers or silent lovers. They were entertainers, intellectuals, sometimes even political informants. They could read, write poetry, debate philosophy, and keep pace with senators after 3 cups of Falernian wine. Some were ex-slaves who'd worked their way up through the brothel hierarchy. Others were born free but chose a life of calculated companionship over the restrictions of marriage. Either way, they knew the game. They weren't just selling sex, they were selling presence, intrigue, mood. Think more geisha than streetwalker. One famous courtesan was Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman who became the mistress of Mark Antony. She travelled with him publicly, scandalising polite society. Cicero loathed her, not just for her past, but for her audacity to move in high circles. She was visible, bold and clever, and those traits made her dangerous. Not because she threatened Rome with armies or alliances, but because she disrupted the tidy narrative of where women were supposed to belong. The legal status of these women varied wildly. Some were registered sex workers, required by law to wear distinctive clothing, usually shorter tunics or bold accessories, to signal their availability. Others operated in private salons, behind locked doors where wealthier clients could indulge without the risk of being seen in a brothel. These private affairs gave the illusion of intimacy. They were illusions that many men willingly fell for. Meanwhile, down in the back alleys and among the merchant class, there were less refined versions of this dynamic. Mistresses who might not be educated or celebrated, but who were still entwined in households across the empire. A merchant might keep a lover in a small rented flat near his shop. A freedman might fall in love with a laundress and set her up with a bit of income and a promise he could never make official. These relationships were informal, often unequal, but real, woven into the rhythms of Roman life. And here's a quirky side note for you. There's graffiti in Pompeii that actually gives us glimpses into these relationships. Scribbled on the wall of one building are words like, "Marcellus loves Julia," and "If anyone wants to meet nice girls, come to the Lupanar." These weren't love poems, exactly. but they hint at a culture where romance, desire, and public declarations were tangled up in everyday life. One particularly snarky line reads, "Lucius was here with Flora, he paid." Not exactly subtle. The legal divide between wife and mistress was clear, but socially? That's where things got fuzzy. Some concubines were treated better than wives. A man might loathe his spouse and lavish gifts on his lover. Children born from concubines might not inherit by default, but if acknowledged and legitimized, they could climb the social ladder. Some even ended up with political power if their father was high enough in the ranks and willing to ignore the whispers. One of the most dramatic historical examples, the Emperor Augustus's own granddaughter, Julia the Younger, was exiled for an affair, and not even a particularly scandalous one by Roman standards. Meanwhile, his close associate Maecenas openly lived with a woman who was never his wife, and no one blinked. Again, status carved the rules. Morality flexed when power entered the room. Now, there's still a scholarly debate that echoes through this topic like the sound of a lyre down an empty corridor. Were these mistresses and concubines exploited victims, or savvy agents within a limited system? It's probably both. Some women had no real choices. Slaves given to masters, girls sold into brothels. Others learned how to survive, even thrive within the system's cracks. They found patrons, built networks, wrote poetry, even advised politicians. They weren't empowered in the modern sense, but they weren't powerless either. And yes, of course there were scandals. So many scandals. Entire political careers were toppled over affairs gone wrong. Love letters discovered, jealous wives whispering to rivals, secret pregnancies that required quiet adoptions, or, more often, harsh decisions no one talked about in daylight. If you've ever wondered what fueled Roman gossip, it wasn't just gladiators and Senate speeches, it was who was sleeping with whom and why. As you step out of the alley and back onto the main street, the lines between official and unofficial feel blurrier than ever. In a city obsessed with hierarchy, where even desire had rules, the people who coloured outside the lines, the mistresses, the lovers, the unwed companions, they were both scorned and secretly envied. They lived in a space outside duty. And in Rome that was the ultimate rebellion. As the sun rises higher and the heat begins to press down on the cobbled streets, you make your way south, past the teeming market stalls and smoky tabernae, until the roads begin to show cracks and ash. The stones under your feet shift to volcanic dust. You're walking the streets of Pompeii now, or what's left of them. And though Mount Vesuvius froze this place in a moment of fiery silence, its walls still speak. Because here, more than anywhere else in the Roman world, the people left their desires out in the open. On walls, doors, tavern counters, even on stairwells, they didn't write love letters, they wrote graffiti. Step into the Lupanar, Pompeii's most famous brothel. The stone beds are still here, small hard platforms with faint divots worn by time and repetition. The walls are covered in frescoes that don't even pretend to be subtle. Figures caught mid-thrust, mid-laugh, mid-seduction. There's a menu of sorts painted above the doorways, showing different sexual acts like a catalogue, and yes, they were probably priced. The pictures weren't just advertising, they were instructions, a reminder that not everyone who visited could read words, but everyone could read a body. But it's the graffiti that really paints the picture, sometimes crude, sometimes funny, sometimes strangely sweet. One scratched message reads, "I screwed the barmaid." Another, "Successus was here, full of desire." And then this one, "I don't want to sell my body anymore. Fortune take me home." It's not all jokes and bravado. There are moments of loneliness, vulnerability, even exhaustion etched into these walls. These weren't just messages, they were small acts of defiance or longing or drunken honesty. A Roman version of, "I was here." You start to see a pattern. Sex in Pompeii wasn't something to be hidden or cleaned up for company. It was everywhere. Painted above bakery ovens, doodled outside bathhouses, carved into public benches. There's even a famous example from a guard room. The one-eyed man has banged every girl in Pompeii. Big claims for a guy missing depth perception. Of course, not all of it was about sex. Some graffiti were insults. "Floronius, you're a bore." Some were attempts at poetry. "I love Homeros. May Venus love us both." Others were just bits of daily life. "I paid 2 asses for a haircut. He still messed it up." But the sexual inscriptions make up a huge portion, possibly because that was one of the few safe ways to express yourself in a rigid, status-driven society. Scribbling something vulgar on a wall was a kind of equalizer. Rich or poor, slave or citizen, you could leave your mark, and that's what makes Pompeii so fascinating. Unlike Rome, where elite writers shaped most of what survives, Pompeii lets you hear from the butcher's apprentice, the prostitute, the jealous lover, the drunk poet. It's a snapshot of real lives, real bodies, and real messiness. For example, one particularly graphic wall note reads, "Restituta, take off your tunic and show us your pretty thing." It's crude, yes, but it's also unfiltered, no censorship, no marble polish, just human want carved into plaster. And then there's the question of who was writing this. Most graffiti were done by men, that much is clear from context and tone, but there are a few inscriptions that suggest female authorship, possibly sex workers or bold local women taking control of their own narratives, if only for a sentence. One reads, "Myrtis loves crescens." That's it. But it feels different. There's affection there, not conquest. Here's a quirky historical footnote. Archaeologists originally dismissed the Pompeii brothel frescoes as too obscene to catalogue properly. For decades they locked these items in what's called the Gabinetto Segreto, or secret cabinet of Naples' Archaeological Museum. Only men could view them, with written permission, no less. The idea was that these objects were too corrupting for women or the general public. Even 2,000 years after they were painted, the moral panic hadn't worn off. It's only in recent decades that scholars have re-examined Pompeii with fresh eyes, not as a den of sin, but as a mirror of everyday Roman life. But here's where scholars disagree. Some argue that Pompeii was uniquely sexualized, possibly because it was a port town full of sailors, traders, and travellers, that it's unfair to hold it up as a symbol of all Roman sexuality. Others say the city was simply preserved unusually well, and that Rome itself was just as sexually expressive. Its graffiti and brothels simply didn't survive the centuries as intact. There's no scholarly consensus, just layers of ash and interpretation. One thing's clear though, for the average person in Pompeii, sex was a public subject. Not shameful, not sacred, just part of life. You didn't whisper about your crush behind closed doors. You carved their name on a tavern wall. If you had a great night with someone and you didn't leave a thank you note, you scratched it into stone. And some of the messages are surprisingly relatable. "I hope your hemorrhoids burn, Oppius." That's less about love, sure, but who hasn't wanted to etch a bad review into a bathroom stall? As you leave the ruins and look back at the cracked mosaics and singed frescoes, it's easy to forget that the people who lived here didn't see themselves as frozen in time. They lived, they laughed, they got jealous, they fell in love, they got dumped. And yes, they had sex, with joy, with frustration, with hope, with guilt, not behind closed doors, but out loud, with a chisel and a wall. It makes you wonder what someone 2,000 years from now will find of your messages. The DM you regretted, the anonymous forum post, the group chat confession, will it look any different? Probably not. You leave the stone beds and soot-stained walls of Pompeii behind and follow the steam. Literally. The closer you get to the heart of Roman civilization, the warmer the air becomes, thick with the mineral tang of sulphur and the faint sweetness of perfumed oil. It leads you to the thermae, the Roman public bathhouses. And before you roll your eyes and think this is just about hygiene, let's get one thing straight. In ancient Rome, the bathhouse was less about washing and more about watching. You step inside past a towering marble facade, and the first thing you notice is the noise. It echoes. Water sloshing, sandals scraping across wet stone, laughter, arguments, the hollow thunk of a strigil scraping sweat and oil off skin. It's a sensory overload. The smell of warmed flesh and pine resin. The faint whiff of incense someone decided to bring for flair. This isn't a spa retreat. It's a social arena. And for many Romans, it's also the most sexually charged public space they'll enter all week. Roman baths were open to nearly everyone. Rich or poor, slave or senator, you all passed through the same pools, though at different times or in different corners depending on your rank and your coin purse. Some bathhouses segregated by gender. Others didn't bother. Especially in the early empire, everyone stripped down. You'd have seen everything and everyone saw you, which in a society obsessed with dominance and appearances meant your body was on display in more ways than one. There was no such thing as modesty here. You might be discussing trade routes while the guy next to you oils his inner thigh. You might be chatting with a politician who casually lifts one leg onto a bench and reveals far more than his opinion on grain subsidies. It wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Bodies weren't hidden. They were public property, especially for the male citizen. You were expected to be fit, composed, in control. If your stomach sagged or your thighs jiggled too much, someone might write a poem about it later. Marshall and Juvenal made careers out of mocking flabby patricians who couldn't pull off their bathhouse struts. Now, here's where things get steamier. The apoditerium, the changing room, was often where flirtation started. Locker rooms with columns and benches, places to undress, gossip and scan the room with one eye while pretending to look for your sandals. Once you made it to the tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot room, or frigidarium, cold plunge, the dance of glances really got going. There were no towels to hide behind. Everyone knew what they were seeing and what they were showing, and yet for all this exposure, outright sexual acts weren't openly permitted. Not officially. The bathhouse was a public institution, not a brothel. But the rules were slippery, much like the floors. Sex didn't happen in the pools, supposedly, but in the rooms attached, the massage parlours, the side chambers, the dark corners. Some bathhouses even had upstairs lounges with couches and curtains, where business could be conducted away from watchful eyes. Here's a quirky little detail. Roman bathhouses often employed attendants called elliptae, who were not just oil scrapers but often masseurs. And massage in Rome was rarely just massage. If a wealthy patron requested an extra hand, the elliptae would oblige or get someone who would. That service wasn't free, but it was discreetly arranged. Think of them as the ancient world's worst-kept secret. There's evidence that brothel workers were sometimes stationed near or within large thermae. A patron could get clean, gossip with senators, flirt with a slave boy or girl, and then slip away for a more intimate appointment. It was one-stop shopping with the added benefit of hot water and political networking. One preserved bathhouse in Ostia, Rome's port city, features mosaics with playful and occasionally risque imagery. Dolphins, tridents, nude athletes with just enough detail to raise an eyebrow. These weren't just decorative, they were mood setters, reminders that the bathhouse was a sensual zone. Not sexual in the vulgar sense, but charged with energy. Everyone was watching. Everyone was watched. There's a famous letter from Seneca in which he complains about the noise at his local bathhouse. Men grunting, girls laughing, bodies slapping against water, arguments breaking out, coins clinking, gossip echoing off the marble. He found it unbearable. But that chaos is what made the bathhouse the place to be. It wasn't just about washing dirt off your back, it was about maintaining your place in the social order. Who you spoke to, who you didn't speak to, who you sat beside in the hot room, every move was measured. Now, scholars still argue over how much actual sex happened inside the bathhouse walls. Some say the steamy rumours are exaggerated by the moralistic writers who wanted to criticise Roman decadence. Others believe the bathhouse was, essentially, a state-sanctioned flirtation zone with plenty of unofficial business going on. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. There's little doubt that some bathhouses were more respectable than others. Some catered to families. Others? Let's just say if the walls could talk, they'd start with a wink. And yes, these spaces were dangerous too. For lower status individuals, especially slaves or freed persons, the line between flirtation and coercion was thin. If you were young, attractive and unprotected, you could be touched, harassed or worse. It wasn't fair, it wasn't safe, but it was the reality of a culture where power trumped consent. One wrong glance could turn into a humiliating encounter, one you couldn't complain about without risking punishment. Still, not all encounters were exploitative. Some were consensual, playful, even affectionate. People met lovers in the steam. They made eyes across the cold plunge. They brushed fingers while applying oil. The bathhouse, for all its chaos, allowed for chance encounters, the kind that don't happen in structured, supervised spaces. You didn't need to know someone's name. You just needed to like the way they looked wet. As you leave the bathhouse feeling slightly overheated and more aware of your own body than you'd like, you can't help but marvel at how naturally the Romans wove sensuality into their public routines. Here, sexuality wasn't hidden in bedrooms or behind euphemism. It steamed and shimmered in the open, slipping between gossip and grooming, politics and pleasure. And when the water cooled and the lamps were extinguished, the real heat, the kind whispered about over wine, lingered in the stories people carried home. You step out of the bathhouse, skin still warm from the caldarium, head spinning with equal parts eucalyptus oil and unspoken tension. But once you rejoin the dry world of togas, sandals, and strict social ladders, everything snaps back into place. Suddenly the freedom of the thermi evaporates. You're reminded that in Rome, what you could do in the shadows often had nothing to do with what you were allowed to do in daylight, especially if you were a woman. Tonight, we're staring down one of Rome's most glaring injustices, the ironclad gender double standard. Start with the basics. If you were born male and free, you had options. Not necessarily happiness, not necessarily control over your life, this was still a brutal world, but the social machine was oiled to favour your body and your choices. You could pursue sex, take lovers, visit brothels, boast about affairs in the forum. You were expected to have appetites. It was part of being Roman. Lust was fine, as long as you kept it structured. Wives for heirs, concubines for comfort, prostitutes for play, and slaves for, well, whatever you wanted. It was a grim buffet, and you never went hungry. Now flip that reality, you're a woman. Let's say you're upper class, because being poor adds a whole new layer of difficulty we'll get to later. You're married off by 14, maybe 15, to a man you didn't choose, one whose political career depends on your uterus behaving. You're expected to keep your legs together and your opinions quieter than a temple mouse. Adultery, that's not just a scandal, that's a crime. Punishable by divorce, exile, and social annihilation. Even the suspicion of impropriety can cost you everything. And don't even think about confessing love for another man. That's not seen as passion, it's betrayal. Treason, practically. Meanwhile, your husband is out bragging over garum-soaked oysters about the 3 slaves he bedded last week. No one blinks. If you complain, you're called jealous. If you stay silent, you're a good wife. If you retaliate with your own affair, you're a whore, and probably on your way to a windswept rock in the Aegean, where noble women go to disappear. Let's talk about one such disappearance. Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus. She was smart, witty, wildly popular among the young elite, and according to reports, not all that interested in playing the part of chaste Roman matron. She had lovers, many of them. Some say she met them in the forum, others say she met them in the very house Augustus had given her. When the rumours grew too loud to ignore, Augustus, yes, her own father, had her exiled. Not just quietly removed from court, but publicly condemned for violating the new moral laws he had passed. Laws that, just to be clear, didn't apply to men in the same way. Her lovers were either exiled or executed. Julia, banished for life. She died far from the city she once lit up with her laughter. Her name was erased from monuments. She became a cautionary tale. This wasn't an exception, this was policy. And don't be fooled by the seductive images of goddesses and priestesses lounging with grapes in hand. Real Roman women had very little control over their own sexuality. Their virginity was a family asset, their wombs a political tool, their pleasure mostly irrelevant. Roman love poetry is full of longing, jealousy, and desire, but rarely from the woman's perspective. She's an object, a muse, a reward, or worse, a threat. If she loves too freely, she's dangerous. If she resists, she's a cold-hearted tease. And if you were lower class or enslaved, things were even worse. You had no legal protection at all. A male citizen could use you however he wanted, without consequence. If you bore his child, it didn't matter. The child was a slave like you, unless he specifically freed them. You could be rented out, trafficked, sold with reproductive potential listed like an extra skill on your resume. And still, even then, Roman society would blame you if a scandal emerged. That's how deep the double standard ran. The people with the least power carried the most shame. Now here's something odd. Despite all this, there were moments when women exercised quiet agency. Not freedom exactly, but navigation. They sent coded messages through servants, wrote erotic poetry under pseudonyms, passed down contraceptive recipes like family heirlooms. One recipe involved a mixture of wool soaked in pomegranate rind and honey, inserted before intercourse to prevent conception. Effective? Probably not. Symbolically important? Absolutely. It was a small act of resistance in a world where women were expected to conceive on command. Even in literature, you can find flickers of pushback. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, gives advice to both men and women on how to seduce and deceive. He tells women how to cheat discreetly, how to fake tears, how to manipulate their lovers. It's cheeky, sure, but it's also subversive. Ovid knew the game wasn't fair, so he handed women a few cheat codes. The state didn't like that. Augustus exiled him too. And scholars, they're still debating the impact of these cultural rules. Some argue that elite women actually wielded considerable influence through their roles as wives, mothers, and social hosts. Others insist that any power they had was tightly tethered to a man's status. The truth, of course, is tangled. Some women bent the rules, others broke them and paid. Most just found a way to survive inside them. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Roman funerary art, husbands and wives are often shown side by side, lovingly gazing at each other. The man holds a scroll, the woman holds a spindle or key. It's meant to show their harmony. He manages the public world, she the private. It's sweet, sure, but also a reminder. She stays in the home. He goes out and lives. As you walk through the forum, past the grand temples and fading statues, it's hard not to feel the weight of that disparity. The stones whisper of generals and senators, but the women? They're harder to find. Not because they weren't here, but because their voices were silenced, their stories stripped of complexity, their pleasures erased or punished. So next time someone says Rome was all orgies and free love, remind them it depended very much on who you were. For some, desire was a celebration. For others, it was a sentence. You slip away from the chatter of the forum and duck into a quieter colonnade near the Curia, where marble steps glint in the midday sun and the shadows of history feel a little longer. It's easy to imagine that these stone walls were silent witnesses to treaties, decrees, and the measured hum of debate, but also to something a little juicier, because Rome wasn't just ruled by laws, it was ruled by whispers, and nowhere were those whispers louder than in the Senate. Tonight, we're poking around the scandal-soaked linens of Rome's political elite, where sex, ambition, and shame made for one very messy power triangle. The Senate of Rome on paper was the embodiment of gravitas. Stiff robes, stiff necks, and supposedly stiff morals. These were the men writing laws, leading armies, and debating the future of the Republic. But behind those polished speeches and carefully trimmed beards, oh, it was chaos. Senators weren't monks, they were men, and some of them were very busy after dark. Sexual rumour was a political weapon. If you couldn't defeat your rival on the floor of the Curia, you might just out him as a libertine, an adulterer, or, gasp, a passive partner in bed. That last one was especially fatal to your image. As we've said before, Romans didn't define sexuality by gender so much as by power roles. A senator accused of being submissive in sex wasn't just being mocked, he was being symbolically stripped of his authority. If he couldn't rule in the bedroom, how could he rule in the Republic? One of the juiciest examples comes from Julius Caesar himself. His political enemies called him every woman's husband and every man's wife. They whispered that, while stationed in Bithynia, he'd played a little too nice with King Nicomedes. The accusation haunted him for years, even when he was conquering Gaul and rewriting Rome's history. It wasn't just personal, it was political ammo. In Roman politics, you didn't have to prove anything, you just had to get people laughing at the idea. That did the damage. Now, whether the Caesar Nicomedes rumour was true, historians debate it. Probably not, but that didn't matter. The idea of the great Caesar being penetrated by a foreign king, that was the insult. It made him vulnerable, foreign, feminized, out of control, and it followed him all the way to the Ides of March. The obsession with sexual purity, at least for appearances, extended to an entire political family's image. Wives, daughters, even distant cousins had to behave impeccably, or risk dragging down a man's career. Remember Clodius Pulcher? He was caught sneaking into the women-only Bonadir festival dressed as a woman. Why? To seduce Pompeia, the wife of Julius Caesar. The scandal was massive. Caesar divorced Pompeia immediately, not because he believed she was guilty, but because, in his words, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. That one line echoed through Roman history. Being squeaky clean wasn't enough. You had to look clean, smell clean, and never be caught near dirty laundry. It's not like the senators were behaving, though. These were the same men hosting private dinners where dancers and prostitutes were entertainment, where slaves served drinks while barely dressed, and where deals were made in between groans of pleasure and the clink of goblets. Some senators kept male lovers, others boasted about mistresses like they were wine vintages. But as long as it didn't make headlines or wall graffiti, it was shrugged off. Quiet indulgence, Acceptable, public scandal, that was where the knives came out. One emperor who really pushed the boundary was Elagabalus. A teenage ruler from Syria, he was appointed emperor at just 14 and shocked Rome with his flamboyance, gender fluidity, and unapologetic sexuality. He married 5 women and took male lovers, including a charioteer he called his husband. He wore makeup, preferred to be called a queen, and is said to have hosted banquet orgies that made even Caligula look tame. Senators were horrified. Not necessarily because of the sex, but because Elagabalus didn't hide it. He wore his scandal like perfume, and that made him dangerous. Eventually, he was assassinated and thrown in the Tiber. His name was scraped from records. Lesson learned, the Senate could handle perversion but not visibility. And yes, there were fringe cases that make your jaw drop. One senator was rumoured to have held orgies where he assigned lovers to guests by lottery, like a perverted version of Secret Santa. Another was said to use slaves as living furniture, a table of backs, a cushion of thighs. Exaggeration? Maybe. But the fact that these rumours existed, and were believed, tells you what kind of sexual theatre Rome was capable of imagining. Here's a quirky twist. Romans used astrology as dirt too. Political rivals might circulate your birth chart and claim that your Mars placement made you weak in bed or submissive to women. That Saturn in the 7th house meant you'd fall for prostitutes. Your stars weren't just mystical, they were mudslinging material. And even tomb inscriptions weren't safe. One senator's epitaph subtly suggested that he remained faithful to his wife despite temptation, which is basically ancient Latin for he tried, bless his heart. Another was accused posthumously of keeping a male lover disguised as a scribe for 30 years. By the time the rumours hit the marble, there was no way to defend himself. Reputation in Rome was never safe, not even in death. But not all senators were sexual villains. Some were genuinely devoted to their wives, some avoided scandal like plague, and yet their stories rarely survived because they didn't fuel the gossip mill. History, like any good forum crowd, remembers the outrageous. Scholars still argue about how real these political sex scandals were. Were they propaganda or reflections of real chaos behind closed doors? Some say the Senate was simply full of hypocrites, men who enforced public morality while indulging privately. Others argue that the salacious stories were invented by later writers to spice up dull records and sell scrolls. But even if half the stories were lies, the fact that people wanted to believe them says plenty about the world we're looking at. So as you sit there on a worn Senate step, letting the stone warm your back, you realise something. The men who ruled Rome weren't gods or saints. They were ambitious, insecure, and deeply human. And their lust, just like their greed, never stayed behind closed doors for long. It leaked into law. It echoed in insults. It shaped empires. You wander uphill now, past the clatter of wagons and the whispers of shopkeepers, towards something softer in the Roman imagination. Something sacred, glowing with oil lamp light and perfumed with myrtle and rosewater. You're headed for the temple steps, where devotion and desire once blurred into a single golden thread. Because while Rome had plenty of bedrooms and brothels, it also had its gods, and some of those gods were very into sex. Tonight, we're stepping into the embrace of Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and the kind of sensual chaos that could topple kings. To start, you have to understand that the Romans weren't shy about mixing religion with physicality. Unlike later moralizing societies, Rome's divine pantheon wasn't above human behaviour. The gods got jealous. They lied. They cheated. They seduced. And none more so than Venus. Known to the Greeks as Aphrodite, Venus was more than just a pretty face. She was the force of attraction itself, the magnetism that pulled lovers together, the glow in flushed cheeks, the impulse that makes people do stupid things in the name of romance. Her temples weren't austere places of silent worship. They were lively, fragrant spaces full of offerings, prayers, and rituals designed to invite favour in matters of love, fertility, and beauty. If you wanted your partner to stay faithful, you brought Venus a garland. If you hoped to conceive, you left a honey cake. If you were in love with someone you really shouldn't be in love with, you begged her for help, or forgiveness. The temple of Venus Erycina, perched on the Capitoline Hill, was especially famous. Legend had it that she helped protect the Roman state itself through her power to pacify desire. Soldiers prayed to her before battle, not just for victory, but for safe return to the lovers and families they left behind. And if they were particularly devout, they might leave behind a token. A carved phallus, a bronze hand making a lewd gesture, or even small votive statues with exaggerated breasts and hips. This wasn't considered obscene, it was holy. You might think, wait, sex in religion? Isn't that sacrilegious? Not in Rome. For them, sexuality and spirituality weren't opposing forces. They were complementary, fertility was divine, pleasure was a gift. Even the wedding night had ritual overtones, with offerings to Venus to bless the act of consummation. It wasn't about purity, it was about power, and not the kind you measured in political victories, but the kind that swells in your chest when you're deeply wanted. Now, things get more mystical when you bring in cults, especially the imported ones. Rome was a cultural sponge, and it happily absorbed exotic religions from across the empire. One of the more provocative was the cult of Isis from Egypt. Her followers believed in resurrection, sensual ritual, and divine motherhood. Ceremonies honouring Isis often involved music, incense, and symbolic representations of union between heaven and earth. Some scholars argue that her rites had sexual undertones, possibly even ecstatic experiences that bordered on trance. Not everyone was comfortable with that. In fact, the Senate once tried to crack down on foreign cults they deemed too wild or too effeminate. They feared that uncontrolled desire, even spiritual desire, might weaken the state. Too much worship of passion, it might make men soft. Too many women gathered in secret, it might make them bold. Still, the people kept praying, kept offering, kept believing. You can't outlaw longing. Here's a strange little historical twist. One Roman festival, the Vinalia Urbana, honoured both wine and Venus. Think about that pairing. It wasn't just about drinking and flirting, it was about celebrating the ripe, the juicy, the sweet ferment of life itself. During the festival, women, yes, even respectable matrons, could pour libations and make pleas for romantic satisfaction. Whether those pleas were spiritual or carnal is up for debate. Knowing Rome, probably both. There's also the matter of sacred prostitution, a much contested concept. Some ancient sources claim that in certain temples, priestesses, or specially chosen women, would offer themselves as part of rituals honouring love deities. Not transactional like in brothels, but symbolic. A merging of body and spirit. Scholars have fiercely debated whether this ever truly happened in Rome, or whether it was misunderstood accounts of fertility rites. Some say it's just Orientalist fantasy. Others point to the presence of sexually themed votive offerings, phallic charms, vulvas carved in marble, as proof that Rome didn't shy away from mixing the holy with the erotic. One thing's for sure. Romans wore their divine desires on their sleeves, or around their necks. The fascinum, a phallic amulet, was worn to protect against the evil eye. Babies had them. Soldiers wore them into battle. You'd see them hanging on doorways, carved into walls, even worn like jewellery. They weren't obscene, they were magical. A reminder that sexuality wasn't just pleasure, it was powerful, dangerous even. So powerful it needed to be harnessed, protected, and occasionally weaponized. You find yourself now in a small shrine to Venus Cloacina. Yes, that's a real title. Protector of both love and the sewers. It's hilarious, but it makes a weird kind of sense. Even love gets messy. Even beauty needs a drainage system. In Rome, nothing was too sacred or too profane. Everything had its place. But let's not romanticize it too much. Religion also upheld the very double standards we've seen before. Temples welcomed men's offerings for sexual success, but punished women who stepped too far outside their roles. A priestess caught in an affair might be flogged, exiled, or executed. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred women, were required to remain chaste for 30 years. If they broke their vow, they weren't just fired, they were buried alive, their lover was publicly whipped to death. Venus might bless lovers, but Vesta demanded obedience. There was no middle ground. Still, even within those harsh systems, Roman religion gave people a way to express their erotic hopes without shame. To pray for touch, for connection, for fertility, even for good sex, because why wouldn't you want the gods on your side when you stripped down with someone who made your stomach flutter? As you leave the temple, the air warm with incense and memory, it hits you. To the Romans, sex wasn't just an act. It was a force of nature, something divine, something to honour, something to fear, and above all, something that linked mortals to gods with a single shared fire. You stroll back toward the bustle of Rome, away from the perfume-soaked temples and toward something grittier, more human, and far more chaotic, the tangled scrolls of Roman poetry. Not the sanitized verses school teachers like to quote, but the wild stuff. The love poems, the dirty jokes, the raw scribbles of desire dressed up in metaphors and cloaked in honeyed Latin. If you want to know what sex felt like in ancient Rome, not just what it looked like on mosaics, you turn to the poets, and boy did they have opinions. Start with Catullus. Think of him as the original oversharer. His poems swing between rapture and rage, sometimes in the same stanza. He adored a woman he called Lesbia, a literary mask for a real aristocratic lover, most likely Clodia Metelli, the same scandalous Clodia accused of poisoning and partying a little too freely. When Catullus was in love, he made you feel it. His poems are dripping with longing, breathless descriptions of kisses, give me 1,000, then 100 more, and that particular kind of obsession that feels both sacred and incredibly needy. But then, when she spurned him or slept with someone else, his verses turned acidic. Suddenly she's a whore, a liar, an animal. His poems about her oscillate wildly, which honestly makes him feel kind of modern. You've probably seen this same emotional whiplash in your friend's texts at 2 a.m. He's not heroic. He's messy. And that's what makes him so real. Through his words, you can feel the pulse of Roman sexuality, not just physical desire, but jealousy, ego, humiliation. Sex wasn't clean or idealized, it was stormy. Then there's Ovid, the smooth-talking playboy of Latin literature. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, is essentially a how-to guide for seduction, delivered with a wink and a glass of wine. It's got tips on where to meet women, the theatre, obviously, how to flatter them, lie but charmingly, and how to navigate affairs. Discretion is key unless you're writing poetry about it. He even wrote a companion book for women, filled with snarky advice on how to fake orgasms and manipulate moody lovers. Ovid wasn't trying to elevate love to something pure, he was giving you the script for the performance. Of course, Rome's power-hungry moralists didn't love Ovid's work. In fact, Augustus, who was on a mission to promote modesty, marriage, and baby-making, eventually exiled him. The reason? Officially, it was for a poem and a mistake. The poem was likely the Ars Amatoria. The mistake? Possibly helping someone in the imperial family manage an affair. Scholars still argue about it. Was Ovid just a scapegoat, or had he really crossed a line? Either way, he spent the rest of his life far from Rome, writing melancholic verses about exile and cold beds. Even Propertius, who tried to play the sensitive boyfriend role, wasn't immune to the madness of desire. He worshipped his lover Cynthia, turning her into a goddess and a monster within the same poem. He praised her beauty, her cleverness, her cruelty. His writing drips with contradictions, she enslaves him. He wants her more, she sleeps with someone else. He threatens to die of heartbreak, and also to haunt her bedroom forever, like a ghost in a toga. But here's the thing, these poets weren't writing in a vacuum. They were responding to and shaping the sexual culture of Rome. Their work was read aloud at parties, shared among friends, quoted in arguments. These weren't dusty volumes. They were living documents passed around like gossip, full of coded references, inside jokes, and barely disguised scandals. You can practically hear the wine glasses clink between stanzas. And if you're thinking, okay, but this is all elite male perspective, you're absolutely right. The voices we hear most often are from privileged men writing for other privileged men, about women they idealized, resented, or objectified, sometimes all three at once. Female desire is filtered through male insecurity and projection. The women in these poems rarely get to speak. When they do, it's often through the poet's fantasy of what she should say. That said, there were Roman women poets, though their work survives in frustrating fragments. One name that floats through history is Sulpicia, a young noblewoman whose surviving lines offer rare, raw glimpses into a woman's erotic voice. In one poem, she writes of her joy at finally getting to sleep with the man she loves. She doesn't beg forgiveness or hide behind modesty. She says, basically, I wanted him, I got him, and I'm not sorry. Her words feel bold, unapologetic, and so rare that scholars still argue whether they were truly hers or the invention of a male poet using a female mask. We can't even let her speak without debating if her voice is real. But even if it's mostly men doing the writing, their work tells us something crucial. Roman sexuality was emotional. Not in the candlelit, let's hold hands and talk about our feelings way, but in the raw, teeth-grinding, pacing the room at midnight way. Love in Roman poetry was a fever. Sex was a battlefield. There was pleasure, yes, but also ego, pain, power, and panic. And here's a quirky note. Many Roman love poems included references to magical rituals, charms, curses, potions to win back a straying lover. Propertius once begged Venus to bind his lover to him so tightly she'd forget every other man. Another poet threatened to bury wax dolls and inscribe curses in lead tablets. This wasn't just literary flair, it was part of a broader cultural belief that love, when left to its own devices, was too dangerous. Better to bind it, tame it, force it to obey, even in verse. By the time you leave the circle of poets, your head buzzing with meter and metaphor. You've seen another face of Roman sexuality. Not just the act, but the story of the act, the longing, the heartbreak, the endless cycle of desire, rejection, and revenge. You don't need to see what happened in the bedroom. You can read it, etched in verses, bleeding onto parchment, full of passion and poison. Because in Rome, love wasn't quiet. It was shouted across courtyards, scrawled onto papyrus, and whispered through history in the trembling voice of a poet who probably should have just taken a nap. Now that you've wandered through the sticky sweetness of love poetry and heard every desperate, obsessive syllable, it's time to scrape the sentimentality off your sandals and look at what was going on behind the villa walls, the kind of intimacy that didn't get poetic meter or honeyed couplets. It's the blunt, brutal side of Roman sexuality. Tonight, we step into the shadowy heart of the Roman household and confront one of the empire's ugliest truths, the widespread sexual exploitation of enslaved people. First, a reality check. Rome was a slave society through and through. At its height, as much as a third of the population in the city might have been enslaved. Slaves were everywhere, in the streets, in the kitchens, in the fields, in the bedrooms. And to the average Roman elite, an enslaved person wasn't a person. They were property, a tool, a resource, which meant they could be used in any way the master saw fit, including sexually. Sexual access to slaves wasn't just common, it was normalized. Roman law didn't forbid it. In fact, it assumed it. A master could sleep with a male or female slave as long as it didn't interfere with another citizen's rights. If you violated someone else's property, that was a problem. If you used your own, no one blinked. Consent wasn't a factor. Slaves couldn't say no. They weren't legally capable of refusal because they weren't considered to own themselves. So picture this. You're a young enslaved woman brought into a wealthy household at 13. You serve wine, you clean. And then one night the master calls you to his bed. There's no refusal. Maybe he calls it affection. Maybe he doesn't bother pretending. Maybe the lady of the house knows and looks the other way, because she has no real power to stop it. Your body is just one more thing he owns, like the mosaic floor or the pet monkey in the courtyard. If you become pregnant, the child is his property too, another slave. Unless, of course, he chooses to free the child, or you. It's entirely up to him. Some enslaved concubines were eventually manumitted, granted freedom, especially if they bore children the master liked. Others were passed along like heirlooms, or sold, or discarded. No ceremony, no protection. The Roman term verna referred to a slave born in the household. These individuals often grew up closer to the family, raised alongside the master's children, educated, trusted. But even that familiarity didn't protect them. In fact, it made them more vulnerable. A young, attractive verna might be groomed from childhood to become a bed slave. Raised to obey, flattered with small privileges, told it was an honour to share the master's bed. It wasn't. It was coercion in silk. Male slaves weren't safe either. Wealthy men used both boys and men as sexual property. Young male slaves, especially those considered beautiful, were sometimes castrated to keep their voices high and their bodies docile. These spadones might be used as entertainers, musicians, or personal attendants, roles that often came with unspoken expectations. The line between affection and ownership was a cruel illusion. One of the ugliest practices? The deliciae, literally, delights. These were children, usually slaves, groomed specifically for pleasure, shown off at banquets, dressed in fine clothing, fed sweetmeats, paraded like pets. To the Romans, it was decadence. To modernize, it's straight up horrifying. Even ancient critics like Seneca, who generally avoided moral finger-wagging, expressed discomfort at the way some elites treated their enslaved favourites. especially when they discarded them like worn sandals the moment they became less charming. And yet, despite all this, some of these relationships are described in Roman literature as love. Masters wrote poems for their enslaved lovers. Some even freed them, married them, tried to legitimize the bond. But what does love mean when one person can't leave? When saying no means punishment? Those stories may be more about guilt or illusion than romance. Here's a historical detail that will make your stomach turn. During the Saturnalia festival, when social roles were temporarily reversed, masters were expected to treat their slaves, even dine with them. Some sources describe the atmosphere as light and festive. Others suggest that this 1 week of freedom often involved an uncomfortable farce, masters watching slaves pretend to enjoy themselves, or using the opportunity to stage games that blurred the line between amusement and humiliation. Sexual favours may have been expected as part of this twisted performance of equality, and yet within this brutal system there were moments, fleeting, fragile, where enslaved people carved out bits of agency. Some fell in love with other slaves, created secret families, raised children quietly in the corners of crowded villas. Others performed small acts of resistance, withholding affection, faking illness, sabotaging chores, running away. A few even killed their abusers, though the punishment was swift and brutal. Crucifixion wasn't reserved for rebels, it was for anyone who disrupted the master's will. There's a famous chilling law from the reign of Nero. If a master was murdered in his home, all the household slaves could be executed, regardless of guilt. Why? Because it was assumed they should have prevented it. In one case, over 400 slaves were killed after their master was found dead, many of them women, children, cooks, and nurses. It wasn't justice. It was fear masquerading as order. Still, scholars debate how typical these horrors were. Were most Roman households violent sex camps? Or were these the extremes the outliers recorded because they were so shocking? Some argue that many elite households treated their slaves well by Roman standards, which mostly meant not beating them daily. But even in the kindest homes, sexual access was taken for granted. The system didn't require brutality to be immoral. It just required ownership. And what about love? Could a real mutual relationship ever exist between a Roman and an enslaved person? It's the big debate, even now. Some scholars point to rare examples of lasting partnerships, freedmen who stayed with their former masters, couples who built lives together after manumission. Others argue that the imbalance of power taints any affection beyond repair, that even if feelings were real, the foundation was rotten. You step out of the narrow alley behind the domus, the one where the servant entrances and slave quarters hide behind perfumed courtyards. You try to imagine what it was like to live every day in someone else's home with no legal body of your own, to be seen, touched, used, and forgotten, because someone else said it was their right. It doesn't leave you with poetry, it leaves you with silence. And in that silence, Rome's grandeur dims a little. And you wander out of the household shadows and into something even murkier, something forbidden, whispered about behind columns and behind closed lips. Because for all Rome's public bravado, for all its erotic graffiti and naked frescoes and poets hollering about their love lives in rhyme, there were still places it feared to look. Places where sex crossed into the realm of the taboo, not just disapproved, but dangerous. Tonight, you're brushing up against the edge of the Roman moral cliff. Incest, forbidden love, and how the elite sometimes treated their family tree more like a spiral staircase. Now, let's be clear, Roman society had rules. Plenty of them. They banned marriage between close relatives, especially siblings, direct bloodlines and parental relationships. The laws were there, the customs were firm, you couldn't marry your sister, your daughter or your niece, unless you were powerful enough to change the rules. Because as with everything else in Rome, when it came to taboo, what mattered wasn't the act, it was who was doing it, and whether anyone had the guts to call them out. Take the emperors. If you're looking for the soft, warm glow of wholesome family values, do not look at the Julio-Claudians. These were people who twisted family relationships into pretzels so tight they'd make a genealogist cry. Claudius, yes, the stammering scholar emperor from history books, married his own niece, Agrippina the Younger. She was brilliant, ambitious, and by many accounts utterly terrifying. Their marriage was technically illegal, so Claudius had the Senate change the law. Problem solved. Morals, flexible. Of course, Agrippina had her own game to play. Her son from a previous marriage was young Nero, yes, that Nero. Claudius adopted him, made him heir, and then, wouldn't you know it, died under suspicious circumstances not long after. Rumours, never quite confirmed, suggested Agrippina poisoned him to secure her son's throne. And here's where things take a turn from Game of Thrones into full-blown soap opera. Later gossip claimed she had an incestuous relationship with Nero. Whether that was true or not, Nero didn't do much to squash the rumours. In fact, some reports say he had a concubine who resembled his mother, just so he could keep reenacting the fantasy. Yikes! And what happened to Agrippina? Well, in classic Roman fashion, her son had her assassinated. It took multiple attempts, poison, a collapsing ceiling, and finally just good old-fashioned stabbing. Talk about your twisted, Oedipal drama. But the point here isn't the murder, it's the way Romans processed the idea of incest. When done by emperors, it became a metaphor for power gone rotten. Even if it wasn't happening, the rumour itself was damning. It made you seem out of control, ruled by lust, too arrogant to observe the natural order. That's what terrified Rome most. Now here's a different kind of taboo. Adultery between in-laws. You were forbidden to sleep with your stepmother even after your father died. Same with stepchildren. The ties of family didn't have to be by blood to be considered sacred. It was about preserving the appearance of order. A son seducing his father's widow, or a stepmother trying to control her stepson through seduction, that wasn't just morally wrong, it was politically radioactive. These stories littered Roman gossip like broken amphorae. Take Messalina, wife of Claudius, yep, the same Claudius who later married his niece. Guy had a type. Messalina was infamous in Roman law for her so-called insatiable appetite. One of the most outrageous tales, probably exaggerated but widely believed, claimed she entered a sexual competition with a professional prostitute and won, outlasting her over 24 hours. But the scandal that did her in wasn't the volume of her lovers, it was the boldness. She allegedly married her lover, Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away, attempting to set him up as emperor. Whether or not she actually tried to replace Claudius is debated, but the fact that she dared to blur the line between family and politics was enough. She was executed, along with most of her inner circle, because in Rome family impropriety wasn't just gross, it was a threat to power. And here's a weird little wrinkle. Despite their public revulsion toward incest, the Romans were weirdly tolerant of cousin marriages. Marrying your first cousin? Fine, encouraged even if it helped to keep wealth in the family. The line was drawn much closer to the core. Siblings? No. Parents or children? Definitely no. But cousins? Perfectly acceptable. It's a reminder that Roman taboos were about social boundaries, not biology. If it didn't destabilize the structure, it was allowed. Now, if you really want to dive into the dark end of the pool, you get into stories that were meant to shock even by Roman standards. Caligula, for example, was said to have slept with all three of his sisters. He brought one of them, Drusilla, with him to public ceremonies like a wife. Some sources claim he declared her a goddess after her death. Others say he beat her to death while she was pregnant with his child. Was any of it true? Hard to say. But Caligula was so loathed, so infamously unstable that anything seemed plausible. And that tells you more about Rome than the man himself. So what do the scholars say? Some argue that incest rumours were political tools, invented by rivals to paint a target as unfit to rule. Others believe that, while rare, incest did happen and was sometimes even ritualised, especially among imperial families trying to mimic divine or Eastern traditions. Either way, the fact that the Roman imagination kept circling back to incest tells you something about their fears, that the very intimacy meant to preserve family could also destroy it. And for ordinary Romans, the line between forbidden and merely frowned upon was blurry. Seducing your sister-in-law? Scandalous but survivable. Sleeping with your niece? Not great, but maybe manageable if no one found out. But touch your own daughter, even by rumour? That was social death. Even the poets steered clear. Well, most of them. Ovid toyed with the idea once, but even he seemed to flinch. Here's a quirky detail. The Romans believed incestuous desire was a kind of madness. It wasn't just immoral, it was unnatural, like a river flowing backward. Some physicians even treated it as a disease of the mort, with herbs and diet changes recommended to restore proper appetites. As if you could just cal salad your way out of an attraction to your cousin. By the time you step out of these twisted family tales, your stomach might feel a little sour. And that's okay. Not every part of Roman sexuality was celebratory or playful. Some of it was sickly sweet, like wine that's gone to vinegar. The elite, especially, lived in a pressure cooker of control, inheritance, and appearances. Sometimes they broke, sometimes they didn't care, and sometimes they destroyed everything around them just to feel something. You take a slow turn away from the poison-slick corridors of dynastic drama, half hoping things might lighten up. Spoiler, they don't. Because now you're walking into the lion's den, the imperial palace, and no matter how wide the halls, how smooth the marble, or how delicately the incense coils through the air, you can't help but feel the weight of power here. That's because you're entering the bedrooms of Rome's emperors, and if you thought the scandals ended with the Senate, well, welcome to the next level. Tonight, you're unwrapping the twisted appetites of men who ruled the world, and didn't think the rules applied to them. Let's begin with Caligula. Because, of course we are. He ruled for just 4 years. But what a 4 years they were. To this day, no emperor's name is more synonymous with sexual madness. He's described as sleeping with his sisters, turning the palace into a brothel, and ordering noble women to perform like prostitutes at private orgies. Some say he even held dinner parties where couples were paired off, ordered into side rooms, and then judged on their performance when they returned. How much of this is true? That's the eternal debate. The sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, wrote decades later, and they clearly hated him. But even if only a fraction is real, it paints a picture of absolute power with zero boundaries. Caligula's supposed most famous act of sexual cruelty? Publicly bedding the wives of senators at banquets, not in secret, in full view of everyone, or close enough. The ultimate move of dominance, taking not just a man's wife but his status, his pride, his face. Afterward, he'd brag about the experience, sometimes even giving reviews. This wasn't just lust. It was psychological warfare performed in silk robes and gold sandals. But Caligula was just the opening act. Enter Nero, child of Agrippina, heir of ambition, and walking Greek tragedy in a laurel crown. He married his stepsister Claudia Octavia, but he wasn't interested, so he divorced her, accused her of adultery, ironic, and had her executed. Then he moved on to his mistress Poppaea Sabina, who he supposedly kicked to death while she was pregnant. Gruesome, yes, but Nero wasn't finished. One of the strangest, most often repeated stories? Nero fell in love with a young freedman named Sporus, who looked strikingly like Poppaea. So Nero had Sporus castrated, dressed him in gowns, and publicly presented him as his wife. They went on tour together, attended banquets. Nero even gave Sporus a dowry. And no one stopped him. They couldn't, because to defy Nero was to die. In this case, to love Nero was to lose your body and identity, replaced by a ghost of a woman he destroyed. And then there was Elagabalus, the teen emperor who made Caligula look restrained. Coming from Syria and appointed by his grandmother's political maneuvering, he took the throne at age 14 and immediately began flipping Roman norms inside out. He wore makeup, dressed in women's clothes, and declared himself married to a man. Well, technically to several men, one of whom was a charioteer he adored and called his husband. He had wives too, 5 of them, and one of them was a Vestal virgin, an act that was both legally forbidden and cosmically sacrilegious. That's the ancient Roman equivalent of marrying the Pope, live on stage while drunk. Elagabalus built a temple to his sun god and allegedly had himself circumcised, wore jewels on his genitals, and offered huge rewards to doctors who could surgically alter him to become more female. Whether that last part was real, exaggerated, or metaphor for gender nonconformity is still debated. But it points to something bigger. Elagabalus wasn't interested in being Roman. Not in the traditional, straight-laced, straight-postured way. He wanted to exist outside the system, and Rome wasn't having it. He was murdered by his own guards at 17, his body dragged through the streets, thrown into the Tiber, all because he dared to live differently, and publicly. Here's something scholars debate endlessly. Were these emperors truly depraved or just victims of hostile historians? Writers like Suetonius loved to scandalize. It made their work sell, so to speak. The problem is, the sources are often biased, written long after the emperors were dead, shaped by political spin. Maybe Nero didn't marry a castrated boy out of madness. Maybe it was grief, power, or a warped idea of love. Maybe Caligula wasn't mad, just cruel. Or maybe they really were as unhinged as described, and the sources didn't even capture the half of it. There's no CCTV, just whispers scratched into papyrus. And what about the emperors who weren't remembered for scandal? Augustus, for instance, built his entire image around modesty and tradition. But even he was rumoured to have inspected young boys and girls before choosing his dinner companions. Tiberius, known for his withdrawn later years on the island of Capri, was said to have kept minnows, children trained to perform sexual acts underwater for his amusement. Horrifying, yes. Verifiable. Hard to say, but the image stuck, and maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. Sex, in the hands of emperors, wasn't just about pleasure. It was about control, domination, theatre. Whether they were indulging quietly or parading their lovers through the forum, emperors understood the power of erotic narrative. Sleep with a man? That's gossip. Be seen sleeping with a man? That's a political move. Take a senator's wife? That's a headline. Castrate a lover and call him your bride. That's an act of cultural rebellion with a side of trauma. Here's a quirky tidbit that puts it all into perspective. The Emperor Domitian, known for his cold demeanour, once passed a law making it illegal to castrate slaves, a move seen by many as oddly humane. And yet Domitian himself was deeply superstitious, terrified of prophecy, and allegedly slept with his niece before later executing her. Because even when they tried to legislate decency, Rome's rulers couldn't help but bend back toward darkness. So by the time you step out of the palace's shadow down its over-polished steps, you feel less like you've visited royalty and more like you've survived a fever dream. These weren't just rulers, they were cautionary tales draped in purple. Their appetites weren't just excessive, they were epic, grotesque, sometimes tragic, and always tangled up in power. In Rome, an emperor's bedroom was never just a bedroom, it was a stage, and what happened there could make, or unmake, an empire. You leave the echoing halls of the imperial palaces behind, letting the oppressive scent of burning myrrh and polished marble fade as you make your way down into the humbler, dustier quarters of the city, the alleyways, the workshops, the shared apartments of the insulae. And here, tucked between the vendors hawking honey cakes and the kids kicking a pig's bladder down the street, is where another truth about Roman sexuality flickers to life. Because for all its grand gestures and legal sermons, Rome had a surprisingly complex and evolving relationship with the same-sex attraction. And unlike what you may have heard, it wasn't just tolerated, it was structured, managed, and very, very Roman. Now, to be absolutely clear, the Romans didn't think about sexuality the way modern societies do. They didn't divide people neatly into straight or gay. They didn't argue about identities the way we do. What mattered wasn't who you desired, it was how you expressed that desire. And as always in Rome, that boiled down to power, status, role. If you were a freeborn Roman male, you were expected to dominate in all things, politics, business, and yes, sex. You could pursue women, of course, but also men, or rather boys. More specifically, younger males of lower status, slaves, freedmen, foreigners. The important thing was that you, the Roman citizen, were the active partner, the penetrator. To receive was to submit, and submission was not considered masculine. So a male citizen sleeping with another man wasn't scandalous, unless he was on the receiving end. Then, social death. That's where things get sticky. There were specific insults for men who were too soft, too willing, too pretty. Words like sinaedus and pathicus were hurled like daggers in the street, terms that implied not just sexual passivity, but moral weakness, effeminacy, a lack of control. Martial, Rome's snarkiest poet, laced his epigrams with them. If you wore your toga too loose, had your hair curled, or showed too much thigh at the baths, someone would inevitably make assumptions. This is where gender expression comes into the mix. Rome allowed for a broad range of behaviour behind closed doors, as long as the outward image of masculinity remained intact. A man could visit a brothel and hire a male prostitute. He could keep a beautiful slave boy for pleasure. He could even fall in love with a man, write poetry, weep about it. But if he let that affection change him, if he got too emotional, too submissive, too stylized, then he risked being seen not as romantic, but weak. Too much Greekness, the Romans would say. That was the insult. They blamed the Greeks for everything soft, sensual, or intellectually decadent. Which is ironic because Roman culture borrowed liberally from Greek homoerotic traditions. Philosophers like Plato had long written about the virtues of same-sex love, about male bonds that were intellectually, spiritually, and yes, physically profound. Roman elites, especially those trained in Greek literature, absorbed those ideas. Some embraced them, others mocked them. It depended on who was watching. One of the more curious practices was pederasty. the socially accepted mentorship-style relationship between an older man, Erastes, and a younger one, Eromenos. In Greece, this was often formalized, ritualized, even idealized. In Rome, less so. While young male slaves were often targets of older men's affections or exploitation, it wasn't framed as a noble bond. It was about access and power. A man could have a boy, but he wasn't supposed to care too much. Sentimentality was suspicious, and yet it happened. Love bloomed in unlikely places, in letters, in poetry, in stolen moments. In fact, some Roman graffiti hints at this. Scribbled in a tavern, "I love Felix and he loves me." Another, more pleading, "Come back, Lucius, my bed is cold." These weren't just jokes. They were snapshots of longing, written not for history books, but for hearts. The Emperor Hadrian, arguably one of the more dignified rulers, had a famous love affair with a Greek youth named Antinous. Unlike the crude obsessions of earlier emperors, this one seemed tender. When Antinous died, under mysterious, probably tragic circumstances, Hadrian was devastated. He deified the boy, built statues, named cities after him, commissioned temples. It wasn't just mourning, it was an act of imperial love immortalized in marble. Even cynical Roman observers couldn't fully sneer at that. It was grief on a divine scale. Still, not everyone got the Hadrian treatment. Most same-sex relationships stayed hidden in private rooms, in coded poetry, or among the working-class spaces where rules relaxed. Male prostitutes, called exoleti or synaiedi depending on who was describing them, were common in brothels. Some were flamboyant, some were discreet, some were young boys rented out by parents or masters. The line between work and abuse was razor-thin. One historical oddity? The Lex Scantinia, a vague Roman law that supposedly punished adult men who engaged in illicit acts with freeborn male youths. But the law was rarely enforced and usually only dragged out during political feuds when someone needed a reason to drag a rival through the mud. Accuse a senator of violating the law, and you might not convict him, but you'd stain his name. That was enough. Scholars today debate how open Roman same-sex culture really was. Some argue that it was largely repressed, that the fear of being labelled passive kept most men tightly guarded. Others point to the sheer volume of erotic art, graffiti, and literature and say, clearly, same-sex desire was woven into Roman life. It just had to play by different rules. The truth is probably both. Rome was a society obsessed with order, and so even love had to obey its rankings. But there were always those who didn't care, who loved anyway, who stepped outside the lines. We have fragments of their stories, letters carved into brick, scribbled declarations, poems, mourning inscriptions on gravestones with two male names side by side sharing a date. Were they friends, lovers, brothers? The record doesn't always tell us, but the heart reads between the lines. Here's a quirky little note. Phallic amulets weren't just symbols of fertility or protection. In some cases, they were worn by men who wanted to signal availability to both genders. It's subtle, but if you were looking, you'd know. Rome had its signals, its codes, its glances across the bathhouse steam. Everyone had a role. The bold played with it. As you move through the crowds again, you realize same-sex relationships in Rome weren't a hidden world. They were a parallel one. Visible to those who looked closely, ignored by those who preferred decorum. Desire didn't care about class or gender, but Rome did, so every love had to pick its place in the hierarchy, or risk being crushed by it. You step into the side streets now, past herb sellers and bead stalls, past the scent of roasted pine nuts and sharp vinegar wine, until you reach something that looks, well, surprisingly cute. A little wooden stall tucked into a crowded market, crammed with tiny objects, charms, trinkets, carved stones, miniature dolls, phallic pendants, and strange knotted cords. Welcome to the world of Roman sexual amulets and love magic, where desire didn't just smoulder behind doors but got bottled, tied, burned, buried, and worn around your neck like a secret weapon. Because in a city where sex was everywhere, people didn't just chase passion, they tried to control it. Let's start with the basics. Romans were deeply superstitious. Every cough, sneeze, or twitch in your left eye had meaning. Naturally, when it came to something as volatile as love and lust, they turned to the supernatural, and nothing says "I love you" like a lead cursed tablet buried under your crush's front step. Yes, cursed tablets. Called defictions, These were thin sheets of lead inscribed with prayers, threats, or magical instructions, sometimes folded, pierced with nails, and buried in graves or wells. The idea was to bind someone, to freeze their affections, punish a rival, or make a desired person fall hopelessly into your arms. One surviving tablet reads, "May Tertius not be able to eat, sleep, or make love with anyone but me." Another says, "Blind her eyes, twist her insides, let her burn with longing." Subtle? Not at all. Effective? That depends who you ask. Many of these were love spells, but just as many were about revenge. The line between erotic obsession and pure malice was thin. If your lover left you, you didn't cry into a pillow. You scribbled down their name, called on Mercury or Pluto, or some local underworld spirit, and buried that pain in the dirt, along with a fingernail clipping or a lock of hair if you were going full hardcore. The Romans didn't just feel love, they weaponized it. But that's just one side of the coin. On the other end were the charms of attraction, the aphrodisiac amulets. These were lighter, flirtier, and usually a little cheeky. A common example, the fascinum, the ever-present Roman phallus, turned into a pendant, door ornament, or wind chime. Some were simple, others had wings or little feet. You'd find them dangling from necklaces, sewn into children's clothing, carved into walls. Yes, children's clothing. Because they weren't considered sexual in the modern sense, they were protective. Symbols of virility, energy, life force. But depending on who was wearing it and how, it could send a very different message. There were vulva-shaped charms too, though far less common. Some were carved into small objects and slipped into pouches with herbs, meant to draw a lover's attention or enhance fertility. Others were baked into cakes for weddings, hidden among the raisins like a sexy fortune cookie. A bride might wear a charm to ensure her husband's desire never waned, or that it returned if it had already started to wander. Which, let's be honest, was probably happening before the wedding wine was even poured. And then there were potions. Aphrodisiacs were big business in the ancient world. You've got your expected ones, oysters, honey, anise, wine. But then things get weird. Goat bile, ground up lizard tails, wolf tooth powder, even Spanish fly, a bright beetle that was ground into a burning hot paste and mixed into the drinks. It caused blisters, irritation, and occasionally death. But hey, no risk, no romance, right? Roman medical writers like Pliny and Galen catalogued dozens of recipes for arousal and fertility. Some involved rubbing mixtures onto the thighs, others were to be swallowed, others still were burned as incense while reciting incantations. One especially charming recipe advised men to carry a dried mouse in a leather pouch during sex to ensure stamina. Another recommended boiling onions in donkey-de milk for a pre-intercourse tonic. If that doesn't scream irresistible, nothing will. But magic wasn't just for lovers. Jealous spouses used it too. A woman might hang a charm over her door to keep rival women away. A man might sneak a cursed object under his wife's bed if he suspected infidelity, or just wanted to keep her docile. The overlap between sex, control, and the supernatural was constant. When trust failed, magic stepped in. You'll even find references to love magic in Roman literature. In Ovid's Amoras, he jokes about women tying love knots and mixing secret potions. In The Golden Ass by Apuleius, we get a more sinister look. A witch seduces, manipulates, and curses with erotic spells, turning desire into destruction. These stories both mocked and acknowledged a cultural truth. Romans believed in this stuff. Maybe not always literally, but emotionally. Magic gave them a way to express fear, hope, and longing in a world ruled by hierarchy and law. Here's a quirky twist for you. Some love spells were written backward, or in magical gibberish, not because the gods preferred gibberish, but because it added a layer of mystery. The harder it was to read, the more powerful it felt. Some even included strings of nonsense syllables, like magical passwords. Abracadabra has roots in ancient charms. And yes, people paid for these. They bought them in markets, from street magicians, old women with wrinkled hands and too many teeth, or shady scribes who promised results by the next full moon. And of course there were scams. You knew that already. Not all love charms were made with divine intervention. Some were just a clever way to charge desperate people for herbs and shiny trinkets. A lovesick merchant hands over a coin for a guaranteed seduction spell, only to discover it's just crushed mint and beetroot juice. But in a way, it still works. Belief was part of the magic. Scholars debate how seriously Romans took all this. Was it mainstream? Fringe? Most agree it was somewhere in the middle. The educated elite scoffed publicly at love magic, but many of them also quietly hired someone to curse a rival or boost their bedroom luck. Even the Emperor Augustus had magical protections placed in his home, including phallic charms above the doors and secret inscriptions to ward off envy. Because when it came to power and pleasure, no one wanted to leave anything to chance. As you step back into the sunlight, one of those little charms dangling from your fingers like a forgotten souvenir, you realize something strange. Rome didn't separate sex from spirituality. They overlapped, intertwined. Lust was divine, dangerous, delicate. And if you couldn't earn someone's love with status or poetry, you could always bury a spell under their garden path and hope the gods, or ghosts, answered. You find yourself on a quiet rooftop now, looking out over terracotta tiles, clotheslines, and chimneys puffing lazy trails of smoke into the early evening sky. The noise of the forum fades beneath you, the clatter and politics and all that performative Roman virtue. Up here, it's a little different, a little more daring, because you're about to meet the rarest figures in Rome's erotic landscape, women who actually took control, not quietly, not politely, not in the shadows, but boldly, with strategy, sometimes scandal, and more than a little sass. Tonight, we're lifting the curtain on the women who flipped the script. Let's start with a reality check. Roman society wasn't built to let women steer the wheel, especially not sexually. The model woman was modest, obedient, married by 14, and ideally splendid unless she was naming herbs or instructing a slave. But of course, people are people, and some women weren't interested in playing parts written by crusty old senators with bad sandals and worse opinions. Take Fulvia. She wasn't just a power player, she was a political hurricane. She married 3 men, all influential, including Mark Antony. While her political influence is usually the headline, Fulvia also had a personal reputation for being, let's say, unapologetically involved. One story claims she had the severed head of Cicero brought to her and, just for fun, pierced his tongue with a hairpin, possibly the same one she'd used in her coif that morning. Was it revenge? Performance? Either way, it screams, I am not your typical Roman matron. Then there's Claudia Metelli. Yes, that Claudia, the one who broke Catullus's heart and possibly poisoned a man or two. She was so literate, fiercely intelligent, and unafraid to love loudly. In a world where most women had to sneak around to see lovers, Claudia just walked into the forum and dared anyone to stop her. She hosted salons, she quoted Greek poetry, she flirted in public, she was accused of sleeping with her brother, bribing politicians, and running an underground club of aristocratic hedonists. Are all those things true? Probably not, but people believed them because they could imagine her doing it, and that alone made her dangerous. But it wasn't just elite women bending the rules. Freedwomen and sex workers sometimes managed to carve out their own kind of independence, economic and erotic. Some owned property, others ran their own taverns or brothels, a few even managed to retire with wealth and lovers of their choosing. One inscription from a freedwoman named Glycera reads like a mic drop. She lived as she pleased, loved as she pleased, and owed no man a debt. That's not just empowerment, it's rebellion etched in stone. Still, the most intriguing cases were women who operated within the rules, barely, but used them like knives. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, was a master of this. She played the perfect Roman widow, modest veil, sad eyes, maternal concern. But behind the scenes, she orchestrated alliances, seduced powerful men, and maneuvered her son onto the throne. According to some sources, she even offered herself to her son as a way to control him sexually. Is that true? Maybe, maybe not. But again, the rumour worked because she was already terrifyingly competent. And competence in a Roman woman was always suspect. One curious tool of control: literacy. Roman women weren't supposed to read or write fluently. That was for scribes, poets, and men who liked to show off their Greek. But the women who could write letters, poems, love notes, held power over men who weren't used to being outversed. Sulpicia, whose poetry still survives, didn't ask for permission to love. She just wrote, I am no ashamed to admit it. I chose him, and I delight in that choice. It's not a whisper, it's a roar, dipped in ink. Now, scholars will debate endlessly. Were these women exceptions, or do they hint at a broader undercurrent? Some argue they were rare outliers, unique and privileged. Others suggest that more Roman women were subverting expectations all the time, just more discreetly. After all, power doesn't always look like marching into the Senate. Sometimes it looks like choosing who to let into your bed and why. Even fashion could be a form of rebellion. The standard Roman woman wore a stola, a long, modest garment that practically screamed, "I'm respectable." But some women abandoned the stola for the more revealing Greek-style tunics. This wasn't just a wardrobe choice, it was a statement. Roman men lost their minds over it. Poets accused them of promiscuity, moralists clutched their scrolls, but the women didn't stop. Some wore perfume heavily, some painted their cheeks. These weren't random choices, they were signals. I am not here to be quiet. Let's talk about Roman cosmetics for a second. While the average matron might apply a bit of rouge with crushed rose petals, bolder women experimented with elaborate hair dyes, saffron eyeshadow, and lip colour made from mulberries or, disturbingly, cinnabar, a toxic mercury compound. They wore jewellery that jingled, cloaks in rich purple tones normally reserved for aristocrats, and snake-patterned sandals. They weren't dressing for subtlety, they were dressing like they owned the damn street. Here's a quirky footnote. In some cases, Roman women wrote their names above their lovers on graffiti. A reversal of the usual order. It seems like nothing, right? But in a world that treated women's names as private, almost sacred, writing it publicly and boldly, especially linked to a romantic conquest, was an act of defiance. "I love Secundus," reads one wall. "He is mine. Not beloved by or sought by, just mine." That's the whole game right there. Even inside marriages, women could find subtle ways to assert control. They learned how to manipulate inheritance laws, how to secure property through carefully worded wills, how to maneuver alliances through their children. A clever Roman matron could turn her home into a fortress of quiet influence. She might not be able to vote, but she could decide who got her daughter's hand. She could shape the next generation of Rome, one subtle word at a time. Of course, these acts of power came with consequences. Women who stepped too far out of line were smeared as nymphomaniacs, witches, or traitors. Roman literature is full of panicked warnings about the woman who reads too much, talks too much, or wants too much. But the fear itself, that's proof of the threat. If Rome had truly believed women were powerless, it wouldn't have worked so hard to keep them in line. By the time you step down from that rooftop, the light fading into the kind of soft orange that makes every scandal seem like a legend, you realise something. Roman women were never just scenery. Some endured, some escaped, some seduced, some ruled, and some did all of it without ever asking permission. Now take a deep breath. Not a metaphorical one, a real one, because the air's about to change. You're walking downhill now through Rome's grimiest streets, where the stone is slick with spilled wine, and who knows what else. The perfume of Venus has given way to the sharper scent of sweat, smoke, and cheap oil lamps. You're heading into the red light district, Rome Subura, and tonight you're stepping inside the lupanar, the brothel where the realities of sex were carved into stone and priced by the hour. Let's just say up front, Roman brothels weren't coy. The word lupanar literally means wolf den, and prostitutes were often called lupae, she-wolves. Whether that's empowering or dehumanizing depends on how you look at it. But the metaphor stuck. And if you're imagining a shadowy building tucked discreetly into a back alley, think again. These places were loud, bold, and sometimes even advertised their services with pictures and graffiti right outside the door. The idea of privacy? That belonged to the upper classes. Step inside. The rooms are tiny, cramped, and shockingly uniform. Stone platforms barely wide enough for two, covered in straw or worn linen if you were lucky. The walls are decorated with frescoes showing various sexual positions, not as pornography